welcome to the second of 3 webinars on provenance research offered by AAMC. My name is Mackenzie Mallon. I'm the provenance specialist at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City, Missouri, and I'll serve as your moderator for today's conversation. First things first, I want to thank AAMC, Judith Pinero, and David Saunders for the opportunity to bring this topic to you today and for their invaluable guidance and support throughout the planning process. Welcome back to those of you who attended the first webinar in this series on provenance, which was held last week and focused on World War II era provenance research advances. This second iteration of the webinar will focus on the provenance of non-Western and indigenous objects and antiquities. Following today's presentation, you'll be able to access the recording of the webinar, additional information, full biographies of the speakers, all on the AAMC website, so I encourage you to check that out. For the next hour or so, we plan to discuss several topics that are relevant to provenance research on non-Western, indigenous, and ancient objects. And throughout the webinar, you're welcome to submit your questions to us, to the speakers, through the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. You can submit those questions at any time, and we'll do our very best to address them as part of our discussion. As I mentioned previously, the first webinar in this series focused on advances in World War II era provenance research. And although World War II era provenance often garners more attention, conducting provenance research on non-Western and indigenous objects and antiquities is equally vital to responsible collections care. So we've gathered together an exceptional panel today with experience in these collections, and we hope that we can discuss the unique challenges and the rewards of conducting provenance research in these fields. Just a few introductions. Kathleen Bickford-Burzak is the Associate Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Bloch Museum of Art at Northwestern University, and she joins us with an extensive background in African art. Trish Capone is Curator and Director of Research and Repatriation at Harvard's Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology, and she'll speak to us from her wealth of experience dealing with the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which we all know as NAGPRA. Tom Hardwick, who joins us from Egypt today and eagerly awaiting the next World Cup match over there, is Consulting Curator of Egyptology at the Museum of Natural Science in Houston. And Tom will share his knowledge of provenance research on antiquities. And finally, Keith Wilson is the Curator of Ancient Chinese Art at the Smithsonian's Sackler, where he specializes in Chinese antiquities. So welcome to all of our speakers. We have 7 broad topics of discussion that we hope to address during today's webinar. And since our speakers work in such widely disparate fields, each with its own provenance research challenges, our panelists will speak to each discussion topic from their own experiences. Our topics will include how the emphasis on World War II era provenance has impacted research in these fields, provenance research methodologies, resources, networking, engaging the public with provenance, and the effect of repatriation and restitution. And we hope to wrap it up with maybe considering some next steps in the field. So I thought, without further ado, we'd just go ahead and dive right into our first discussion topic. Last week, we heard a really excellent webinar on advances in World War II era provenance research, and indeed, there have been many advances in this field in the past 20 years. But how's the work that has been done on World War II era provenance issues impacted research in your own fields? Keith, since you're at the Sackler and the Smithsonian's Provenance Research Initiative has been really a guiding force in the field for years, I was wondering if you would care to begin.
Sure. It actually was through a World War II era claim that provenance research came to the Freer and Sackler. An object that had been bought in 1938, and at the time its original source had been queried by the museum, told by the dealer Ctlu that the object had recently come from China. The piece was purchased. Fast forward to the year 2000, and there was a Nazi-era restitution claim made on the object, which was, as it turned out, the subject of a forced sale in Germany in 1935. It was really courtesy of this experience with Nazi-era claims that the museum began a broader study of its own collection more broadly. It's focused even now primarily with a permanent collection on the World War II era for the historical collection. That's different, however, when it comes to new acquisitions. And for new acquisitions, it's more broadly engaged with issues of cultural patrimony, Unesco Convention, and so on. So I'd say that in researching the historical collection, the funding, which is primarily grant-driven, so soft funding, is focused on the World War II era, but more broadly for any new acquisitions to the collection.
Tom, working in Egyptology, have you had a similar experience?
So my own, as an Egyptologist, I think the World War II issue, it's something that Egyptologists and curators of Egyptian objects haven't looked into particularly thoroughly. What I feel World War II, so that side of the provenance, when you say provenance, that's often the first, World War II is the first thing you think of. That puts it into a framework that's not necessarily, that's sort of, in a sense, quite adversarial, which is not so much, and sort of imposes a model on archaeological fields where it's not necessarily so appropriate. When you're dealing with material that has at some point come out, that's been excavated, that's been out of human sight for thousands of years, the big issue is illegal excavation rather than appropriation of somebody else's known property. And that's something that leaves almost no documentary trace. So you're looking at things in a slightly different way. I would also, so you're looking at provenance with Egyptian material, it's a slightly different setup for, say, classical in two ways. One is that pharaonic culture is by and large confined to geographically to modern Egypt. So if you have an Egyptian looking object, the chances are very good that it comes from modern Egypt. You don't have the worry about, if you have a classical style object, does it come from anywhere between Spain, Britain, or all the way through to Afghanistan, say. You're dealing with one ancient culture in one modern country. Finally, the other difference is with Egypt, at least, the relevance of the UNESCO Convention is slightly different, as opposed to Greece, Italy, or Turkey, where cultural patrimony laws are very strict and date back over 100 years in some cases. It was legal to buy and sell antiquities in Egypt up until, within certain restrictions, up until 1983. So collecting Egyptian material, you have, it's a slightly different set of dates and standards you're looking to conform with.
So clearly provenance research in these fields has its own unique set of challenges. So let's turn to the methodologies that you utilize in your provenance research. Every museum necessarily takes a different approach based on their own unique collections and their resources, but on the whole, we all have to prioritize our work. We have to find the appropriate resources, we have to present our findings. So how do we, and how we do all of this might change depending on whether we're researching an object that's already in our collection, or a pending acquisition, or a loan, like you said, Keith, it can change. Kathleen, can you tell us about the methodology that's been successful for you?
Sure. So I was the curator of African art at the Art Institute of Chicago for almost 19 years, and my provenance research experience really comes out of that context. And I would echo what Tom was saying, in that the Nazi-era provenance, the intensity of attention on Nazi-era provenance research had an impact on the attention that provenance was given in that museum across the board, only in so much as it brought attention to the importance of doing this across our collections, and that each collection had different needs and different questions would be important to be asked. Within the African art field, the major provenance research happens typically through publication histories, but also through, you know, a kind of active correspondence with dealers and with owners of an object, trying to trace its transference from owner to owner from its origin. I do think it's important to think about provenance research differently in terms of researching objects in a collection versus the kind of provenance research that happens for acquisitions. And specifically for acquisitions, there are some important resources that may or may not be accessed when you're researching something already in the collection. At the Art Institute, and I've found every museum handles this a bit differently, but at the Art Institute, we focused on several different benchmarks. One, of course, was the UNESCO Convention, and we wanted to assure ourselves that anything we were acquiring could meet the criteria of that 1970 ruling. And then we would use the UNESCO Red List as a resource, and IFAR, the International Foundation for Art Research database, as a resource. Those resources are incomplete, and so it's important to remember that it's a kind of a process of due diligence. So you're checking these resources, but it's not the end of the story. The final thing that we did at the Art Institute was we actually researched the cultural patrimony laws of each nation, each originating nation, for any object we were acquiring. And there's actually a remarkable variety of cultural heritage and property laws across the 50 nations of the African continent. And so that's a kind of research that requires close collaboration with legal counsel, and I also think just networking within a field of curators, so that we're sharing information about what can you tell me about that, and what you know, where might I go with this question. And then finally, I would just close by saying that I think, you know, provenance research is very object-based and specific. So you know, there are steps one can follow, but each object, each provenance is unique. So it takes you on a different path, and you have to kind of follow that path, object by object.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really informative. Trish, you've worked with NAGPRA, with Native American issues. Can you speak to your methodology in that particular field?
Sure. NAGPRA, implementing NAGPRA to some extent has a newly structured methodology that we utilize to at least document provenance. I think researching provenance, the steps in methodology for anthropology collections has remained, I think, somewhat constant, but the methodologies for compiling, gathering, and reporting them, I think, have been newly structured in part as a result of implementing NAGPRA. So, for example, NAGPRA, one of NAGPRA's requirements, as those who've worked on implementing NAGPRA understand, is to describe the details, report the details for public record of the originating circumstances of the collection, the acquisition, the location of find, collectors, whether it's a gift or, and so forth. So museums implementing NAGPRO will systematically record that. At the Peabody, we've developed mechanisms within our database for structuring our recording of those pieces of information, and also for evaluating their robusticity. So for example, for each piece of information, provenance information, we track the source of the data, and then that in the case of potential conflicts within the data, we are then in a position to evaluate the best source or reach out to colleagues, for example, on questions that might arise. So we have this, we evaluate the information internally, and then the last of NAGPRO's requirements is to report this information for the public record, and all of that is compiled by the U.S. Department of the Interior. This pattern of recording and internally evaluating has provided a model for how we approach provenance for the rest of the collections, and I would say similar to Kathleen for collections from the Americas outside of the United States, referencing the laws and guiding frameworks for the originating nation is an important key as well.
It sounds like you both have had to kind of reinvent or kind of invent your own wheel to a certain extent in each of your fields. Kathleen, you mentioned having to research all the laws for all the different nations on your own and put together all of that. Have you ever attended any, have you ever received any training in how to do this? Are there any resources available for?
Well, I should give credit where credit's due. I was working with the legal counsel at the Art Institute of Chicago, and they did that research. And, you know, I know that they're happy to share that information with colleagues when it's necessary. I actually think that, you know, this is an important next step for provenance in the kind of cultural heritage area would be the development of resources. I think that there actually aren't that many resources for these kinds of, you know, specific questions. And so I think that that's a kind of next frontier for kind of consolidating and sharing information. I also find, you know, like developing relationships is a really good way to move these things forward too. So as an Africanist curator, developing relationships, you know, with colleagues on the African continent is really indispensable in having conversations about mutual protection of cultural heritage.
Yes, and you mentioned development of resources as a next step, and I think that's a great point, because there are so many resources out there for World War II era provenance research now. We've had some really excellent advances in that field in the last several years, but when it comes to resources for researching antiquities or indigenous objects, it's a little bit, it's not as fleshed out yet, and so it's somewhere that we need to look for in the future. And as we all know, how we implement our methodology often depends on our access to necessary resources. And with the increased accessibility of archival resources in recent years, especially through the utilization of digital technology, it's made some information easier and quicker to locate, but other important resources remain inaccessible. Tom, can you describe your experiences with the ups and downs of the availability of provenance research resources?
Yeah, I mean, I've come to this sort of from two ways, both as an academic writing, I suppose, seemingly disinterested articles on the topic of the history of collecting Egyptian material culture, and then also as a curator looking to make purchases. And as I said, until 1983, you could
Oh, Tom.
Oh no.
Well, Tom seems to be frozen. Let's.
sorry, have I just?
Bring you back, Tom?
Yeah, I'm still here. It's the curse. One, you could buy objects in Egypt and export them until 1983. Two, if you were an archaeologist digging, you could expect a share of your finds again until the mid-80s. And this varied 120 years ago, you would get 95%, the museum in Cairo would get 5%. By the end, the proportions were reversed. But vast quantities of material left Egypt under circumstances of greater or lesser legality and opacity. Trying to deal with that, there is no, to cut a long story short, there's no single way of doing it. If you're interested, people who are watching this, do get in touch with me. I can try to give you more of the nitty-gritty. The problem, I guess, that there are two ways of doing it. One is from the out of Egypt side. There are dealers' catalogues, dealers' resources, the Brummer galleries, which the cloisters in New York, they've scanned their records, and that's a superb resource. Sale catalogues with notations. I've written on this. I can send you a PDF of one example I did. And then from archaeological information, publications may have lists of where objects went. There's a big research project looking into that, in how objects from Egypt were distributed in the West. And then there's potentially the far more interesting side of how this was dealt with by the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities up until the 80s. And this is something on which people have tried to look into this, but it's very hard to get anywhere with it. And at the moment, it seems that there's very little, it's hard to excite interest in this in the ministry nowadays, for reasons one can surmise about. So whether you're approaching it academically or saying, hang on, I'm interested in this object, what can you say about it in Egypt? That's a chapter that's waiting its moment to be written. But I think, fingers crossed, sooner rather than later, there must be wonderful information, both for a history of the market and Egyptology, and also for trying to work out what this object that you're interested in purchasing, whether that has records in Egypt rather than on the other side where it turns up in someone's collection. That is both for academic and curatorial reasons. This is still awaiting its moment.
Kathleen, have you had a similar experience with African art?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the points that Tom raises are important ones. And, as I was saying before, provenance is really, it's an exercise in specificity, and objects, have left Africa for many different reasons. Again, kind of looking forward, and I think I'm getting a little ahead in our conversation, so stop me if you want me to hold off, Mackenzie, but, the sort of next wave of focus for African art provenance research, I think almost inevitably has to grapple with the questions of how objects got from Africa to Europe or the US or Asia or wherever they are now. And, there are interesting movements happening now on the part of our European colleagues in conversations about the sort of the colonial past and, what to do with corpuses of material in museums, in sort of museums like the British Museum or the Musée du Quai Branly or, what have you. that focuses largely on objects seized or stolen during the colonial period. But and that's an important history to be thinking about and to be having very open conversations about with colleagues on both sides of the Atlantic. But I think that as we pursue sort of object-based provenance research, we're going to be finding, more and more the need to do the harder work of like field research or archival research that because it is relatively low-hanging fruit to follow the provenance of an object through European collectors or through American collectors by writing the dealer or talking to the original owner or the heir. But to get from that point back to its actual acquisition on the African continent, that's the harder step. And it's, that is an important part of this provenance record. Not everything is seized or stolen. When I've been able to do that work, I know I've acquired objects that were also gifts that came into Europe or the US as gifts, or came into Europe or US as purchases. And these are objects that date back into the early 20th century. So I'm excited about the possibility of thinking about, telling those deeper stories and kind of getting, I don't want to say get past the Black Panther moment, but, to maybe look more deeply and more complexly at narratives of African objects.
Are there important resources on the African continent for this type of research?
Well, yes. There are, I wouldn't say that there are institutional resources per se. Again, you would have to go country by country. But certainly there are resources in terms of memory, family histories, community histories, and it takes a kind of a level of understanding about, cultural, very specific types of cultural practice. And this is where like the laws of the nation are just the tip of the iceberg, right? Each country has its own unique legal structure, but then also within communities, what's the structure of ownership? Who has the right to sell things or get rid of things? How has that changed over time? There's so many important questions that, it just gets more and more complex. And that's why I say it starts to become something more like field work within the African context. And I think that that's a kind of future for this, perhaps.
Sometimes our most valuable resources are not an archive in an institution or a library, but Kathleen, as you mentioned earlier, they are our colleagues themselves, like our colleagues that work in the same field. And maintaining contact with our colleagues who are conducting provenance research at other institutions can be very helpful, because no one person can know where to find every resource or know about every possible constituent. So by collaborating and networking, we can more adequately contribute to provenance scholarship as a whole and successfully complete a greater amount of research. But at the same time, confidentiality requirements often restrain us from freely collaborating with outside scholars, and confidentiality requirements can vary depending on what country we happen to be working in. Trish, with your work with NAGPRA, has maintaining a network of contacts within the scholarly community and as well as in tribal communities, has that helped you with provenance research?
Yes, it has. And a couple of different types of instances come to mind. One is the instance, which I'm sure many have experienced, where collections have been split across various institutions, maybe through institutional exchanges or expedition partnerships. Those types of usually pre-1950 types of occurrences. And in those cases, connections with colleagues at other institutions who are participants or partners in those different situations have been invaluable. And in some cases, for the purposes of implementing NAGPRA, we and partner institutions have worked together along with the consulting tribal communities to for the purposes of implementation, bringing those collections back together. There are some situations where that has made sense. The second type of instance is similar to the situation that Kathleen referred to, where the expertise in place, the knowledge experts from either tribal communities or local historic communities are familiar with some of the characters who were collecting or excavating. So for each community there, as I'm sure others have experienced, will be a niche of expertise, and whether that's particular newspapers or bodies of archives, which are increasingly becoming digitized, those have all been key partnerships to take advantage of. And then we draw all that together and are able, as I mentioned before, through our database to make that available for initial consultation purposes for museum, other institutional and tribal community partnerships. For example, tribal historic preservation officers through a password protected access to the museum's database online.
I just want to pause just briefly to speak to our participants in the webinar today. If you have any questions that you'd like to address to our speakers, please feel free to go ahead and enter those into the Q&A portion of your screen. If you just move your mouse around a little bit, a little bar will open up at the bottom, and one of those things will be Q&A. And you're welcome to pose those questions to our speakers at any time. You don't have to wait for the end. As a matter of fact, we'd prefer you didn't. Go ahead, ask the questions. We want this to be a conversation that very much engages you as well. So please, I encourage you to go ahead and send your questions at any time during the conversation. Keith, I don't want to leave you out here. You have some really valuable experience in Chinese provenance research, and so I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about the importance of networking, maybe also some valuable resources that you have found particularly helpful in Chinese provenance research, or where the field needs to go as far as resources in that area.
Sure, I'll touch on resources first. In terms of recontextualization, that is kind of the field work that we've been talking about, something that has been incredibly useful for research on especially Buddhist sites have been the early photographic surveys that were done by Japanese teams in the opening decades of the 20th century, so that we do have fairly accurate photographic documentation of what those sites looked like before looting really got under sail. And those photographs have enabled us to really reestablish the original locations for a lot of objects that are in collections worldwide. Also informal things like field notes from archaeologists that were working across Asia in the opening decades of the 20th century have been helpful, sometimes illustrated only with pencil sketches, but they can be useful. In terms of resources surrounding transactions, focusing on a few Asian dealers that in fact left fairly accurate archives, often including their stock cards, so that we have a fairly detailed accounting of the movement of objects, what objects were offered to what collectors or institutions over the years. And here I'm speaking specifically about the Ctlu Archives, which were so important to our work on that early provenance project with the 1938 purchase from him, the Western Zhou Gui. But because he left thousands of stock cards for many of the transactions that took place between the company and various American collectors and institutions, they have been really, really resourceful, useful for us. And then to talk about the collaborative question, we have an informal professional organization called the American Curators of Asian Art. And typically at our annual meeting, questions of provenance, provenance research, resources have come up as informal panels or topics for lunchtime conversation. And then those have continued over the months between our meetings through our listserv. So there's, I think, a sense that informally we can share information with confidence.
That's interesting that you mentioned the American Curators of Asian Art annual meeting. It's been my experience that at large annual meetings such as that, or really broad conferences, issues of provenance or provenance research are addressed, but maybe minimally. There might be maybe one session or maybe a couple of sessions. Can any of you, this is a question for any of you, can you think of any provenance related topics that you might like to see addressed at a large conference such as that, where a lot of people working in your field can be reached? A topic that might help people really gain a foothold into this type of research.
I can jump in first. At one of our first meetings, maybe 8 years ago or so, Laurie Stein, who was featured in the panel last week, helped the Freer and Sackler establish kind of a provenance workbook that gives you advice and kind of the steps that are best research practices for work in the field. We distributed that workbook to all of the participants at one of our annual meetings and did a number of individual kind of example practices using that workbook. So that was one specific thing, one specific instance I can think where almost in a workshop setting, we were able to address some of the basic fundamentals.
I have a suggestion relating to database tools. I don't know if this resonates for other people, but a conference situation like that might be a useful venue to give feedback, I guess initially informally, but potentially going forward in a more structured way to database developers for better tailoring the provenance modules in the various database products to our needs. At the Peabody, we've engaged in a lot of retrofitting because so many of the situations of provenance don't fit the mold of the data structure that we use. And there, for example, many of them contain multiple agents, maybe an excavator, a dealer, then a donor, then and so forth. And that's been kind of tricky to work out with the regular tools. I don't know if that's a useful thing for other people, but.
No, I think that's really useful. I know that I've had experience with that as well. Trying to make one particular software fit what you want to do, but everybody else is using it in a different way. And so when it comes time to think about trying to link these together with other institutions, the concept of that is just mind-boggling. How do you even begin? Would any of the rest of you like to speak to database tools or technology that's used to convey the results of your provenance research? Maybe even speak to difficulties, but also to successes, things that have worked for you.
If I can mention one thing, again, objects left Egypt through division of archaeological finds, and one thing which is allegedly being promised, yet to be delivered on, is an index of archaeologists' handwritings and grey and sort of excavation marks. This is initially for British archaeologists. It's part of a big British research project, although it still hasn't come online. But you see, again, I'm sure it will be familiar to many people, archaeologists would, in the good old days, would hand broken, otherwise unenticing objects out like candy to visitors, or museums would, especially in Britain in the 50s, would deaccession stuff because Egypt was no longer in fashion. And so people will often turn up with something saying, well, my grandfather got this from Flinders Petrie or Howard Carter. You know, usually it always comes from the tomb of Tutankhamun. And you can, with a comprehensive database, you could say, well, in fact, you don't bad luck on the family myth. However, you have got some, you've got something which comes from this other excavation, and here's the publication. It's from this tomb or this part of the site. And I was horrified. I was looking into some pottery that had come through a similar, they clearly come from an excavation, and none of my colleagues who dug within this same area knew what the marks were, and these were probably 40 years old. So it strikes me that the knowledge is preserved individually, but there's no group, there seems to be little appetite, in Egyptology at least, for group synergy on, there's this material that is no longer in public hands. How can we, but it clearly came from public excavation, publicly funded excavations. How can we reconcile ourselves with it? That's, again, that's something whose moment is yet to come.
We're starting to get a few questions. So there are several questions here for wanting to share resources. So Keith, someone wants to know if the workbook that you talked about, actually we have two questions wanting to know if Laurie Stein's provenance workbook can be shared. I can't speak to that. Keith?
I believe it's available on the Freer and Sackler website.
All right, great. So take a look at that there. Let's see, question for Keith. Where can the archives of Japanese photographs of Buddhist sites be found?
Unfortunately, it's not one central location. They were published, typically site-specific surveys were done, and so each of the individual sites would need to be queried with your library. A lot of those publications were appeared in the late 20s and the early 30s, so they may not be so readily available outside university museums. But I know in many instances they can be interlibrary loaned, so you can still look them up. But they're great resources.
Yeah, that's true in African art as well, that just looking at old photographs of, you know, sites or communities or shrines, sometimes you find objects that are either you're trying to trace.
In one instance I can think of, those photographs bridge these two questions, and that is with dealer photographs of stock, especially stock that concerns objects that might be considered multiples. For example, Chinese ceramics that were produced in huge quantities in kind of factory style settings, so that standardization was important. In one area where I think databases are going to fail, at least in research on that aspect of the field, is multiples are very, very difficult to track and identify with specificity. And I don't know if anyone has had experience trying to solve that problem. It's particularly a problem in East Asia, where industrial scale production appeared so early on, already really by the 10th century. Multiples were being produced in vast quantities. It's very difficult to be specific when you're confronting a possible acquisition or an object in an historical collection, whether this object is the one that is shown in that photograph.
I think that's a universal problem amongst most provenance researchers, is the difficulty of researching a multiple. We've had several questions that relate to how provenance is communicated to our visitors. So I thought maybe we'd move on to the next discussion topic, which deals with utilizing the results of our provenance research to engage visitors inside our museums. This research often uncovers interesting stories, as we know, and it can help increase public interest in our collections, but only if we communicate those stories, whether it be online or in galleries or in exhibitions. Tom, you've recently worked on an exhibition that incorporates provenance. Would you like to tell our attendees a little bit about that?
Sure. This was an exhibition for a gallery in Southport, a little seaside town near Liverpool, which 100 years ago received an Egyptian collection formed by a local lady who travelled to Egypt, and they commissioned me to put on a display about this lady, Mrs. Goodison. Egypt is taught in British schools, so every 10-year-old in Britain does Egypt for a year, which is wonderful. It keeps us all curators employed, but it leads to quite many displays look very similar. They all talk about burial, worship, and so on. So it was, and then when I've curated displays like that, and people always say, where did this stuff come from? And then, sort of as Kathleen was saying, another thing people will say is, it's stolen. And as you were saying, Kathleen, well, not everything is stolen. And how can we get into these deeper stories? So this exhibition in Southport looked at who this woman was, why she was going to Egypt, and we had, people reacted very positively to it. So as well as her Egyptian collection, which by and large was nothing to write home about, we could borrow better objects that other archaeologists were excavating while she was there. And then we had an Egyptomanic alma-tadema, and then a great John Singer Sargent of Lord Cromer, because people weren't going to Egypt out of curiosity, they were doing it for sound political and financial reasons. And so, thinking of the deeper story, it's the story of the British in Egypt. And that's one, especially in that part of Britain, where the Industrial Revolution was fed by Egyptian cotton. That's something which people are by and large not really aware of. They sort of think, well, Egypt is just something you have in museums, and it's worth trying to dig a little deeper, pardon the pun, and say, well, in fact, especially in Britain, Britain's a long way from Egypt, and the States is even further still. So what makes Egypt of interest to us? So it's also a way of trying to take an Egyptian display, which, as a specialist is always interesting, but try to show why in 2018 we're still looking at Egyptian material. It's of relevance to the modern world, not just because it looks nice.
So we have a question here, which is right on the money. Has anyone had experience with discussing or publishing provenance information that is unverified? For example, something that falls into said to be from category or said to be. And does your institution have different standards for provenance information that was published versus information that comes from a dealer or another source, or what we might consider hearsay? So would anyone like to speak to that topic? Anyone?
Couple of examples.
How about how you deal with it online? You work with provenance a lot online with your collection. How do you deal with recording works that that you have unpublished or unverified provenance information, how do you write that online?
Well, I mean, I'll dive in here. I think that typically when you're doing provenance research, you're trying to get corroboration on the data, right, that you're finding. So, you know, a letter, a photograph, a statement that is that can be notarized. So hearsay it should certainly be in the object record, but whether or not it would appear in the formal provenance statement, I think, is a question that would have to be discussed or have to be really thought through quite carefully, because to me it seems like it's slightly different than a kind of quantifiable record. I'd still want to account for it in the narrative, kind of in a narrative about the knowledge of the object. Mm-hmm. I'm curious to know what my colleagues think, though. I know if I was in that situation, I would be trying to get substantiation. And if ultimately you can't get substantiation of the hearsay, then you would, if you feel inclined to include it, then you would need to include it clearly marked as unsubstantiated.
Yeah, we use qualifiers, and we also acknowledge gaps.
Yes,
because
acknowledging gaps is important.
The notion of pursuing the perfect record is just so difficult, and then the pressure to get what information we do have up and online associated with each object in our collections online feature was important to us.
Great. So we've talked a little bit about, we've had some brief mentionings of cultural repatriation issues. So of course, the provenance of African cultural heritage and colonial objects has recently come to the forefront, especially in relation to Emmanuel Macron's pledge to begin restitution of African heritage from France within the next 5 years, as well as Herman Parzinger's recent call for the establishment of guidelines for researching the provenance of colonial objects. These are just two of many examples in which the provenance of non-Western and indigenous objects and antiquities can be the subject of debate. Kathleen, with your focus on African art, have these issues affected your own provenance research?
Definitely. You know, they're really important questions for us to be asking and for us to be having dialogue about. And I briefly referenced before some important efforts that are being undertaken by our colleagues in Europe around these issues, where there are various groups of people or groups of institutions hosting dialogue with you know, stakeholders from across from around an issue. So say Benin, you know, the sacking of Benin City and the taking of the royal arts of that city. There's a kind of Benin working group that includes representatives from museums across Europe, as well as representatives from the Court of Benin in present-day Nigeria and the Nigerian National Commission for Museums and Monuments. So, you know, these efforts that are unfolding over many years are moving this forward. And I think that it's you know, it's great to see it this happening. And I guess it's sort of within the African art world. I mean, in some ways, maybe I'm interested to hear what Patricia would have to say, because it's a sort of is NAGPRA a model in some ways for these efforts, and what are, you know, what might we learn from NAGPRA?
Trish?
I don't know if it's a model, because I think internationally, I mean, I think elements might be a model. For example, the systematic gathering of provenance data. That's helpful probably across the board. But in terms of structuring a structured mechanism for transfer of title, those types of instruments seem so particular to each country's goals, colonial history, that I think it could be a sounding board, but model I would probably hold on.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of conveying these difficult histories, someone was asking about problematic acquisition histories and so forth in galleries or in other public information. I think it bolsters the contextualizing function of museums. So if a trajectory of interpretation works towards situating the item on view or the grouping of objects or the particular situation in a broader context of understanding, then the contextualizing role of provenance information only supports that effort. So, for example, we're looking at collections in the Peabody's 150th anniversary exhibit that were collected in the context of the World's Fair, and some of the live people setting exhibits there, and exploring that through today's critical lens, where through the lens at the time, those types of situations might have made more societal sense than they do through today's lens. Still reevaluating them with that understanding is a helpful thing to engage with visitors. On the other hand, sharing provenance research with visitors can be a chance to engage items that might not otherwise be as readily interesting to visitors. We're also looking at, in the North American gallery, some stone flakes from northern New England. Their interest grows as one realizes they were collected by Thoreau in the context of being guided by indigenous canoe guides during this 19th century period, where that was a significant sort of societal and world trend. So in terms of sharing provenance in the gallery, lots of contextualizing examples, I think, can be productive.
So we have 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure that I take the opportunity to have you all answer as many of the questions as we can. So I'm just kind of going through some of these. We have a couple of different questions about how to secure institutional support and or funding for provenance research in your particular fields. And of course, this is always an issue. Would any of you like to speak to that topic? Have you had success using or obtaining grants to do this type of research? Are you funded by your own museum or your institution? Are you just fabulously wealthy and just doing it all out of your own pocket? How do you pay for all of this? We all know that it takes a lot of money to travel and to see all of these different archives that we might need to utilize, or to go and actually talk to people who have family histories or community histories. Does anyone have any thoughts on this?
Well, maybe I could start. No institution likes surprises. So in fact, the claim back in 2000 was kind of a clarion call to the institution that this was an issue that needed attention. Early on, support for the research was internally generated, but over time, to continue the process and to avoid future surprises, emphasis has really been placed on securing outside funds, chiefly grant-based funding, to maintain our provenance research endeavor here at the Freer and Sackler. It has traditionally been run through our collections department, although in association with curatorial and other stakeholders within the institution.
I know personally, just speaking from my own experience, I received an artworks grant from the National Endowment for the Arts last year to fund my provenance research travel for 2 years. So just a shout out to the NEA for supporting the important provenance research we're doing here at the Nelson Atkins. So please try for grants, put your applications out there. There are institutions that are willing to fund provenance research through grants.
I agree with Keith's assessment for motivating support for provenance research, that the understanding, I think, is there that having a hand on this is an important thing for institutions to do.
So let's see. Another question we have is, how do institutions balance digitizing object information with confidentiality requirements? Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, that one is, I think it's important to think about like what you're going to do moving forward versus what you're going to do retroactively. So at a certain point in our process at the Art Institute of Chicago, we made it known that all acquisitions were going to require provenance review, and that that in order to make an acquisition, dealers and collectors would need to share that information with us, and that information is not confidential information. So the part of the deal is that the museum has the right to make that public. And that's a lot easier to sort of lay those ground rules moving forward. But retroactively, when you end up with like a file and you've got a important bit of provenance data in that file, and it's labeled confidential, you know, then it's sort of grappling with, well, what do you do with that? Can you return to the person who gave the information and readdress it with them, or an heir? You know, again, I think this gets at the specificity of the work. You know, you kind of have to go on a case-by-case basis and try to track back through those questions of confidentiality in your backlog. But I definitely found that, you know, kind of drawing the line in the sand and saying, look, from now on, there's no such thing as confidentiality. You know, provenance, transparency about provenance is important to us as an institution. And so, you know, this is part of the requirement.
A couple of comments about the UNESCO database of National Cultural Heritage Laws. Kathleen, I think you're the one who mentioned that. Just a comment that not all of the laws are there, but that it can be a useful tool.
Yeah, I didn't mention that one. I know I mentioned IFAR, the International Foundation for Art Research. But all of the research that I've done or that I've had access to on country laws was done internally through the Art Institute of Chicago. So I don't know anything about the UNESCO database. Maybe somebody else does.
Okay. One of the questions about that database is, does the UNESCO database address laws for individual countries? And are certificates required now for cultural items and antiquities? Tom or Keith, do you have any information on that?
I think now racking my brains, the UNESCO website has as many cultural heritage, you know, bits of the relevant legislation as have been provided by the countries themselves. So it's not exhaustive, but it's the best single resource for that I at least know of.
So that would specifically be countries that are signatories to UNESCO and have treaties with, say, the United States or with the UK, or and that's different than cultural patrimony national cultural patrimony laws. Those are two different types of provenance trails.
Yes.
No, sorry. The UNESCO website does have. It certainly has, from my own experience, Egypt's own national patrimony laws there, both in the original and in translation. But scratching my head, I believe the translation is UNESCO's, but I'm not certain. I think that is within UNESCO's remit to have a. It's a service they perform to have them there.
And also to remind people that in addition to the UNESCO, which is kind of a baseline, that there are a number of bilateral US agreements with different countries rich in cultural patrimony, and those need to be consulted as well.
Yes.
And Kathleen, you made a good point about always consulting with counsel, if you have counsel available. We have several questions related kind of on the same vein to documentation that is required for acquisitions when you're importing something. What kind of documentation, cultural patrimony, what kind of documentation relating to cultural patrimony laws might you need if you're going to import a new acquisition?
The export licenses are critical.
Yeah, we would always get the export and the import license. So because you're verifying not just the legal movement out of one country, and also the legal movement into another country, and that can include things like following cultural patrimony laws, but it can also include things like paying taxes.
Let's see, just looking through the list here. Several people want to know how you find time to do all of this. They say that they have to conduct provenance research as just one part of their overall duties, and want to know how you fit in the time to work on provenance research, how you balance that schedule. Trish, would you like to speak to that at all?
Sure. I think it's key to a full understanding of the object. So I really do try to make it part of the regular set of questions that I might approach any situation. But also volunteers, some of the more experienced volunteers or students can be helpful in certain situations to delegate pieces of the research.
Yeah, I've done the same thing. I've worked with graduate students from the local universities who are art history majors. They're, they have great research skills usually, and are often eager to have a fellowship or have an opportunity to do that. We've worked with dedicated staff. I think it is a lot. It depends on the resourcing of the institution, but the conversation about prioritizing this work, I think, is then key, so that time, it's considered to be valuable time spent.
Yeah, and I think also the public face of the research is critical, whether it's through publicly accessible provenance records in your Objects Online page, or if it is, say, a site-specific exhibition that deals with one site that may have been dismembered over time to reconstruct it so that provenance, in a way, as we were saying earlier, becomes part of a gallery project. And then as an exhibition or as a public-facing curatorial activity, it's easier to get a central administration to support the endeavor.
We've talked about provenance research on permanent collections and acquisitions, long-term loans. We just have a couple of minutes left, but I just want to take this one last question and see if any of you can comment on how provenance issues affect internationally traveling exhibitions, often traveling from Africa, Asia, or the Middle East, not necessarily involving an acquisition of the objects, but just bringing in an exhibition.
I'm actually doing that right now.
Yeah.
So I can address that. You know, in order to, so I'm working on an exhibition where we're going to have loans from Mali, Morocco, and Nigeria. And in order to import those loans, we need to make statements about the provenance of the loans for to Homeland Security, as well as to acquire, you know, the judicial, I'm going to get this wrong, but it's the you know, judicial immunity from seizure, which has become a sort of standard, a kind of standard thing to put in place for international traveling exhibitions, because of the way that laws of different countries vary in terms of the ability to be litigious and sue for the you know, recovering of an object. So that's actually probably a whole nother webinar. Immunity from judicial seizure, so-called immunity from judicial seizure, which isn't really immunity from judicial seizure, but that you know, it is work on top of the curating of the exhibition, that you have to weigh in the time and the resources for doing that if you're going to do a show with major international loans, and it does require provenance research. But then you use all the same skill set, right? The same skill set for doing the provenance research itself.
Thank you. Yeah. So we have 1 minute left. So just to wrap things up a little bit, in light of our discussions today, thinking about next steps in the field, I've written down just a few things that I've pulled out of the conversation, including increased development of resources, accessibility of resources, maybe organization of those resources into some more accessible guide or way, or way to put all of those together in an organized manner, financial resources, funding. I think we all wish the time ferry would give us a few more hours a day to do everything that we want to do. And of course, we're grappling with the questions of how objects moved out of their source countries. And that's going to be something we're going to be talking about for a long time. Just in the last 30 seconds, do any of you have any very brief last things you'd like to add?
I mean, I would say the big thing is to be open and clear about what you're doing, because museum goers are interested. Many people are asking these questions already, so it's far better to be open and get out there first to say, you know, to show what you're doing, rather than appear to be responding to pressure. You should, you know, get out there, be excited about what you're doing, and show how important it is.
I think that is an excellent way to end the webinar today. So thank you everyone for joining us. We hope that you found it informative. Don't forget that the final installment of the 3-part webinar series will be held next Tuesday, June 26th at noon Eastern Time. And that webinar will look at the future of provenance research. So we hope you can join AAMC one last time for that important discussion. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you.